The morning of June 25, 1876, dawned bright over the Montana Territory. We of the 7th Cavalry found ourselves roughly 15 miles from what we understood to be a large Indian encampment. At that point, all companies were still riding together. General Custer had gone ahead with a party of Crow and Ree scouts to climb a nearby ridge and get a better view of the terrain and the village below. I remember how quiet things were in that moment, a kind of tense calm before everything unraveled. When Custer returned from that hilltop, the officer's call rang out sharp and clear. We gathered around him. He informed us that our presence had been detected. The scouts had chased a handful of Indians spotted nearby, but they had escaped and were no doubt riding fast to warn the others. Custer had hoped for a surprise attack at dawn, but now that possibility was gone. He told us straight, we'd ride fast, strike hard, and try to catch the village before it could scatter. The assumption, one shared by many, was that a full regiment of cavalry bearing down would send the Indians running. That assumption would soon prove fatally flawed. Troop commanders were ordered to mount up and report readiness to move out. Within moments, the battalions were forming. Custer, along with his adjutant Lieutenant Cook, divided the regiment into 4 battalions of 3 companies each. These went to Major Reno, Captain Benteen, Captain Yates, and Captain Keogh. Captain McDougall, with his company, was assigned to manage and protect the pack train, the lifeline of any cavalry movement. Reno was to charge directly down the valley into the heart of the Indian village, under the promise of support. Benteen was ordered to swing out wide to the left to intercept any groups that might flee in that direction. The rest, Yates, Keogh, and Custer himself, took a path nearly parallel to Reno's, aiming for the village from another angle. It was a bold maneuver, perhaps too bold. That was the last time I laid eyes on Custer. Under Benteen's command, we headed out as ordered, but the terrain turned against us quickly. A series of rough, broken hills slowed our progress. Lieutenant Gibson was sent ahead to scout from the high points, scanning for signs of the enemy. Time and again he returned with the same report, no Indians in sight. We pressed on regardless. Several miles later, we came upon Reno's trail and took it up at a quick pace. It was then that an orderly rode up to us, dust-covered and breathing hard. He handed Benteen a note. It was from Cook, and it said something to the effect of, "We have struck a large village. Hurry up. Bring the packs." The tone of the message conveyed urgency, even desperation. We rode on. As we drew closer to the valley, we could see the fight unfolding, smoke rising, scattered flashes of musket fire, and the chaotic movement of riders. At one point, we spotted a group of men, maybe over 100, fleeing across the river to the bluffs beyond. From our vantage point, it appeared they were Indians being routed by Reno's force. We would soon learn the terrible truth, those men were our own, retreating under heavy pressure. As we neared the crossing point used by Reno, a Crow scout named Half Yellow Face emerged and beckoned us urgently toward higher ground. We veered right and climbed. At the top, we found a grim scene, Reno's battalion battered, shaken, and reeling from a failed assault. Wounded men lay groaning, many crying out for water. It was a bitter moment, realizing our forces had not broken the enemy, but had themselves been broken. There were still a few snipers among the surrounding rocks, but we formed a skirmish line and soon cleared them out. As that skirmish died down, a heavier sound reached our ears, gunfire from the direction of Custer's command. From the bluff, we could make out dust, flashes, and distant figures on horseback. The scale of it suggested something large. Whatever was happening, it was fierce and chaotic. Captain Weir, my commanding officer, turned to me and asked what I thought we should do. I said plainly that we should ride to Custer's aid. He agreed. So did our first sergeant. Weir asked if I'd ride out with just our troop, Troop D, if necessary. I answered yes without hesitation. A short while later, Weir mounted up and set out with an orderly, heading toward the source of the gunfire. He hadn't received formal orders. Later, he admitted he hadn't even asked. Assuming he had, I gathered our men and followed. We advanced into a narrow valley, likely the same or parallel to the one Custer had used. But before we'd gone far, Weir, riding along a ridge, saw a large force of warriors moving in our direction. He signaled for us to veer toward him, which we did. Soon, Captains French and Godfrey joined us with their troops. The engagement was joined. We dismounted and lined up on the ridge, trading fire with the enemy. The gunfire was steady, though not overwhelming, until Reno's order came to fall back. During the withdrawal, one of our men was shot and a horse went down, but we managed to pull back with relatively few losses. Some of the braver warriors ran up behind us, firing at our retreat. Returning to Reno's position, we reformed our lines. The enemy came at us again, this time more aggressively. They poured fire into our position, but our elevated ground gave us the advantage. Still, the tension was thick. You could feel it in the way the men moved, quick, cautious, eyes scanning constantly. As dusk settled, the gunfire tapered off. That marked the end of the first day's battle. We huddled in position as the light faded, wary of a night assault that never came. Many of us didn't sleep. The sounds of the prairie took on an eerie tone that night. The following morning, before the first light of dawn had broken over the hills, gunfire once again echoed through the valley. It started early and heavy, coming from the heights several hundred yards away. For several hours, until around mid-morning, the volleys kept coming in steady waves. After that, the intensity died down, although small bands of warriors still appeared from time to time on the ridgelines, keeping a watchful eye and occasionally taking potshots at our position. By mid-afternoon, we noticed movement across the river. The encampment of the Lakota and Cheyenne, once full of life and activity, was now being dismantled. Teepees were taken down methodically, and not long after, around 4 o'clock, the entire village began to move. From that point forward, the skirmishing dropped off almost entirely. Our position, which we had taken the day before, held firm, and casualties had been minimal since the worst of the fighting had passed. That night we stayed in place, exhausted but alert. The following morning brought with it grim news. Lieutenant Bradley, a scout leader attached to General Terry's column, arrived and confirmed what many of us had feared but dared not say aloud: Custer and his entire detachment were gone. Wiped out to the last man. Shortly after that, General Terry and the rest of his command came into view. Orders were given for us to proceed ahead and bury our dead. The first grim evidence of the battle's cost came quickly. We reached the bodies of Lieutenants Calhoun and Crittenden along with the fallen soldiers of L Troop. The officers lay a short distance behind their men, exactly where you'd expect them to be, leading from behind the lines but not too far to be spared the same fate. Their troopers were still arranged in what looked like a classic skirmish line, their final stand etched into the landscape. Lieutenant Crittenden's remains, riddled with arrows, spoke to the ferocity of the fight. Next we came across the fallen from Colonel Keogh's command. It was clear they had attempted to retreat toward a knoll, the very rise where we would later discover Custer's body, engaging the enemy as they fell back. The remnants of this group were scattered across the field with little order, but all seemed to be converging in that direction. It was not a rout, but a grim withdrawal under overwhelming pressure. At the top of the knoll, we found the bodies of General Custer, his adjutant Colonel Cook, and his brother Colonel Tom Custer. A handful of enlisted men and several horses lay around them. Just below the slope were Captain Yates and Lieutenant Riley, surrounded by yet more dead troopers and horses. Custer's younger brother Boston and his nephew Reed were found some distance off, roughly 100 yards from the general. The brutality of the encounter was undeniable, though the mutilation seen on the battlefield was not universal. Most of the enlisted men were stripped of their clothing, save for the occasional undershirt or socks. Only 2 officers, Tom Custer and Cook, showed signs of having been particularly defiled after death. It was a horrifying but not unexpected reality of frontier warfare. All told, this portion of the battlefield lay on the east bank of the river, just below the main Indian village and a good 4 miles from Reno's defensive position. When we had approached this site the previous afternoon, we saw warriors moving quickly over this same ground, darting back and forth on horseback and firing downward. We couldn't tell at the time what they were shooting at. Only later would we realize it was the lifeless bodies of our comrades they were using for target practice. The battle itself, or at least our involvement in it, seemed to come to a sudden halt the evening of the 25th. When I reached Reno's position atop the bluff, gunfire echoed from the distance. For about 20 minutes the fight raged intensely, and then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence, unsettling and final, hung in the air. Following the burial of Custer and his men, we turned our attention to Reno's fallen, crossing the river to the west bank. We laid to rest around 40 men from that portion of the fight. Nearby, we stumbled upon 2 abandoned Indian lodges. Inside, we found 11 dead warriors, 6 in one teepee and 5 in the other. Their bodies were dressed ceremonially and tied to a pole in the center. Chief Low Dog would later explain this as a gesture of honor. Men who had died bravely were displayed this way, surrendered to the enemy as a sign of respect. I had never encountered such a practice before and suspect that the real reason may have had more to do with the hasty departure of the village than ritual. Around those 2 lodges, we also found as many dead ponies as there were warriors, each animal positioned in a circle around the teepee, heads turned inward. Estimating the size of the opposing force was difficult in the chaos, but I'd wager they fielded at least 7,000 fighting men. I say that based on comparing their numbers to General Terry's column. Terry brought in around 500 troops, and when they descended into the same valley where the Indian camp had been, they looked like a drop in the bucket. The contrast was stark. From tracking the trail Custer's men left behind and speaking with captured Indians later on, we learned that Custer moved along the river's eastern bank. Reno, by contrast, had crossed and mounted his attack from the west side. The terrain was unforgiving. The river, though narrow, maybe 15 or 20 yards wide, was flanked by steep embankments, making access near impossible except at a few fording points. Custer apparently found one such spot about 3 miles down from where Reno had fallen back. It's believed that he tried to cross there and was pushed back, ultimately falling at the spot where his body was discovered. Scattered between that ford and the knoll were the remains of his men, suggesting a desperate fight against overwhelming odds. As for the general himself, Custer's appearance was jarring in its simplicity. The man known for his long golden locks had cut his hair short before the campaign, perhaps to better endure the heat and dust of the trail. His body, stripped like the rest, showed no signs of mutilation. It was as if the enemy recognized him in death and afforded him a final, silent nod of respect, or perhaps simply left him be in haste.